the back? So I want to say that I had all these wonderfully prepared remarks, and I went through them in my head. I was driving down, I was going through all that, and then John tells this airplane throw-up story, and I've completely lost all my train of thought. I'm gonna have to
and your appetite.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for the breakfast warm up there. I appreciate that. We don't want to waste the opportunity that we have having all these smart people all in one room at one time. What we want to do is try to take and be open-minded, exchange a bunch of ideas, and actually create something out of this rather expensive gathering that we've got here. And I add up all the time from all of you expensive people. You know, there's a lot of cost there. Let's try to create some value by thinking about the work that we do. So a little bit about me. I have, I think, one of the best jobs in the world. I get to fly all over the world and talk to companies and study them and look at industries and study them. And the way I do it is I usually do it through the lens of analytics and data. What I do is I create models of these companies so that from that model I can kind of understand how they work a little bit better. See, I'm just a simple mathematician, you know. So I look at the world through kind of a mathematician's lens. I look at a company and I see a bunch of logic and equations and diagrams and data. And so that's the way I sort of strip down a complicated business or a complicated industry and to try to understand it a little bit better so that I can build models of it and take those models and then use those models to help provide insight to these companies and these industries. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And my purpose for talking with you this morning, this kind of opening salvo, if you will, in the user conference, is to kind of open your mind, frankly. Open your mind to thinking a little bit more broadly, even more deeply about your industry and what we can do sort of collectively through technology in some cases, through hard work, through data, what we can do collectively to make this industry work a little bit better. The other thing that I get to do is look at lots and lots and lots of different kinds of organizations. I'm definitely not an expert in any way, shape, or form in the process industries. You know, refining chemicals, base chemicals, specialty chemicals, resins, you know, that whole sort of value chain. I'm not an expert. I've worked in that industry considerably, but I'm not at an expert level like you. So, in a sense, that gives me a little bit of an advantage over you. You know, I get to look at your industry from a kind of a naive point of view and ask questions that people don't always ask questions about that industry. The other thing that allows me to do is to look at your industry versus lots of other organizations that I get the chance to look at. And as you can imagine, in the kind of work that I do, I get a chance to study lots and lots of different companies, and sure, you know, I talk to companies that manufacture things, or I talk to companies that run big supply chains, or do a lot of transportation and distribution, you know, a lot of industrial kind of processes. That's what I do. But I also have had the chance to work with lots of other sort of unique industries. I've modeled criminal justice before. I've worked on a model for money laundering for the FBI. So I got a chance to kind of get a pretty broad experience and look across these industries. And then it was a couple of years ago, and I'll tell you the story a little bit later, but a couple of years ago, I kind of had the opportunity to do a real deep dive into the process industries. And I decided that I would really kind of study what it was, what it looked like, what drove it, what the strategic factors are in that industry. And I came kind of away with 5 conclusions about the industry. And I'll talk about each one of the 5 conclusions today. And we'll kind of go over what that means. I think the bottom line here is that the industry, all of those sub-industries that I mentioned, are poised to have some really significant fundamental changes to that. You know, to be honest, this industry has been pretty sleepy for a long time. It's changed, sure, incrementally year after year, but is it really fundamentally different? It's not today, but it could be as soon as sort of 5 to 10 years. And so I'm going to present to you some of my findings, not as a conclusion because I'm the smartest guy in the room, I'm not by a long stretch, but to sort of get the conversation started. Because it's relevant to you all who are using technology to try to make the work that you do better. Some of this might enter into that. So, why such fundamental change? I did have an opportunity some years back to interact very, very briefly with the gentleman who owns the Yellow Cab franchise in the city of Houston. But back then he told me, he said, George, having a Yellow Cab franchise in a major city is like owning a gold mine. You know, better than owning a gold mine. Gold's already mining for you. You just have to go in there and pick it up on the ground. Yellow Cab, very, very profitable organization. So you look at its franchise. So if you go to any of the major cities, there's a sort of franchise operator working in that city. Today, I haven't talked to him recently, but today I know that for Yellow Cab, the picture has changed significantly. Why? Uber came along. But here's the question. Why didn't Yellow Cab invent Uber? Why did it take an outside company to come along and restructure, reinvent that industry? Airbnb, came along. Why didn't Hilton Hotels create Airbnb? Why? Were they so focused on the day-to-day work of running a big hotel operation that they never sort of saw that coming? These are the kind of fundamental changes that are going on. Hilton alone lost $1 billion in market value when Airbnb was created. $1 billion flushed down the toilet because they didn't see that coming. I don't want that to happen to you all. So, the purpose of our conversation today is to sort of get this whole thing started, get this conversation started about how we can all sort of get on this path to thinking a bit, again, more broadly, more introspectively about the business that we're in, and what kind of tools is it going to take in order to sort of get us there. So, I mentioned sort of the 5 trends. And by the way, I don't use PowerPoint slides. So you're not going to get this nice little pack of PowerPoint slides with all my comments on it at the end. In fact, my company has banned PowerPoint. You can applaud if you want. Thank you, appreciate that. So if I say something interesting, I see some of you are taking little notes. Good, you get gold stars and taking notes. But I want to let's kind of outline these sort of 5 things that are going on. The first one, the industry is finally waking up to intelligence that exists outside the industry. So if I were to transport myself back in time, and have a conversation with a senior leader in any one of your companies, the conversation would kind of go like this. Hey, the pharmaceutical industry has mastered this certain kind of thing. Let's say they've mastered risk management. Might downstream industry or refining of chemicals, kind of take a look at what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry and sort of adopt some of their practices? No. That's pharmaceuticals. That's not us. We're very unique, and we're so much more sophisticated than all of that. There's nothing to be learned from sort of leaping outside of our industry. That's changed now. I'm finally sensing from having these conversations with senior leaders that they're actually able to look out at other industries and adopt some of their practices. And there is one industry that exists today that is leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else when it comes to analytics and data. Do you know what that industry is? Care to make any guesses?
Okay.
Who wants to guess? Healthcare. Okay, that's one good guess. Any other guesses? Finance. Others?
Travel.
Uber. Okay, got kind of that Uber, the transportation industry. Another good guess. Others? Insurance. You're all wrong. Not Facebook. The good guesses. And these are all companies that have done a pretty good job. But the industry that is by far way ahead of everybody else, and there's no second to them, is professional sports. They are doing things that are leaps ahead, leaps ahead. And I've been really fortunate. I have had a chance to have a few clients that are professional sports teams, and I've done some work with them. And it's extraordinary what they're doing. The NBA, for example, in every court in the U.S., there are 8 cameras around the arena. And what they do is they take pictures of the game, and they're able to take and calculate the center of mass of the player. And as they calculate the center of the mass of the player, by the second, they're able to understand how defenses form and see how that works and what players are moving faster than the other. So this is a rather amazing industry. And now let me contrast that with the process industries. Okay, I was having a conversation with the CEO of a major refining company that you would all be familiar with. And I was asking him about, so we were talking about strategy, we were talking about competitive advantage. And he said, George, you know, I'm in the refining business, and we're all the same. You know, I license the same process technology from Shell that my friend, 10 miles away, he has a refinery that he does. We hire the same people. We use about the same assets. We use the same kind of control systems from Aspetek and others. You know, if you look at us, we're exactly the same. There's no difference between my refinery and his, except in one area. And that is how well we do turnarounds. True story. So turnarounds make the difference between an average performer and a great performer. So I asked the next logical question, which was, what the heck is a turnaround? and he said, he laughed like you did. He said, George, every so many years we have to shut the refinery down for 60 days at millions of dollars a day, lost revenue. And that's when we do all our capital improvements. That's when we do all our maintenance work. And I said, okay, well, so what's the big deal? He said, well, 2/3 of our lost time accidents happen during the turnaround period. You're shaking your heads, yes. He said, we never accomplished what we set out to accomplish. Our wish list is this long, and we get maybe accomplish this. There's way too much uncertainty about the turnaround. We get in there 6 days in, and there's a weather event. And if the weather blows more than 25 miles an hour, our cranes can't do a lift, so we have to push that back and the whole schedule. So we spend 3 years, 36 months planning these turnarounds, and 6 days in, 7 days in, 10 days in, that usually goes out the window. I said, wow, okay, that's an amazing story. There's a competitive advantage sort of laid there to do that well. And I've since had other conversations with a lot of other people across the process industries, and all their stories are similar. There's no turnarounds that actually work well. And so I started looking at what is the latest thinking in turnaround. So I started studying these conferences and doing research. You know what the latest thinking about how to do turnarounds better? It's instead of planning them, say, 36 months in advance, well, let's plan them 40 months in advance. That was their idea for how to make these turnarounds better. All right, let's set that story aside for a moment. And let's go to professional sports. So I happen to have the honor, the privilege of going to one of their game film reviews. I was invited to look at game films with the team. This is an NFL team. They happened to do particularly well last year. And so I got in there. Big room, about maybe a little bit bigger than this. flat with like round tables, and the running backs would sit at one table, the linebackers would sit at another table, and so forth. And everybody was there, big screen in the front where they were showing the game films. And assistant coaches would get up. They would kind of talk about the previous game that was played the previous day. They won the game, but barely, against a pretty weak team. So there was a bit of tension in the room, quite frankly. So they're going through the plays. They're showing the plays. They got them up on the screen, and they could sort of go forward and back really nicely. And they got split screens. And they got all the stats and everything. So they're looking at all this data essentially. And the players, very attentively watching all this stuff going on. So they got to a play kind of late in the second quarter. It was a running play. It was a roll right or something they called it. And running back took the ball, and he's rolling to his right. And it was 3rd and 3, I believe. They didn't make the first down. Pretty. In the grand scheme of things, pretty inconsequential, right? That play happens all the time. But that was a very critical play for them. Why, you'll understand here in a minute. So he started asking the running back. They said, what were you thinking about when you were running that play? What were you looking at? Because clearly, you went to the right and here, and if you'd steered a little bit outside, what was going on? And so he got up, and let me tell you, this was fascinating. It wasn't like, you running back, you messed this play up. Why did you mess that up? No. They were trying to extract the information out of him to find out why that play went wrong. So he got up and he said, well, I was looking to my right, I was kind of looking at this guy over here, and he was coming in, and I was watching this sort of linebacker out here, and so I steered this way, guy got a hold of my leg, and I was trying to break free of him. So he was describing second by second. He memorized that from the previous day. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast. But he knew remembered exactly what he was thinking about as this one play was unfolding. So they talked about it. Now, why was this play so significant? The next Sunday, this team was going to play the number 1 defense in the league. They had 3 players on that team that were hurt. If they were going to play this guy, that was going to be one kind of defense. If they were going to play this other guy, that was going to be another kind of defense, and so on. So the assistant coaches get up and they sort of talk about the play and what can be done to fix it. And they said, okay, this week we're going to run 3 sets of drills, each matched to the different style of defense that they could be facing. And that's what they did. So they took those game films. The assistant coaches all, kind of wrote it up, and they had a drill schedule. They had to double up on the drill schedules, which players didn't really care for, but okay. And then the next game, they actually did win the next game. Again, kind of just barely. All right, let's contrast the 2 stories. You got one industry over here that's basically saying, here's a problem, we've never kind of fixed it, and, there's just too much uncertainty. What do we do? Nothing we can do. You've got another industry saying, we're going to embrace that uncertainty and actually use that as a competitive advantage. So what we decided to do to sort of help this organization on the turnaround side is to essentially recreate the equivalent of the Monday morning game film. So what if you could reproduce a process plan? What if you could have that turnaround and play that turnaround back day after day and run it? And what if you could introduce a weather event in day 6, that same weather event in day 12, and that same weather event in day 20, and so on? What if you could sort of stress test your whole sort of tactics and how you approach this turnaround, so that when you get to the actual turnaround and you reach a level of uncertainty that comes along, you've already practiced that 50 times before in 50 different ways. So that's the industry sort of thinking about and adopting practices from other industries that are way ahead on the analytics curve and bringing them back into the industry. So that's a trend that you're going to start to see. You're going to see conversations about how does Apple do this? Well, how does Tesla do this? Well, how does GE do this? And see if that can be intelligently adapted. So that's basically point number one, which is this sort of massive adoption of other things from the industries, from other industries. That just hasn't been an endemic part of the process industries before. The second thing that's happening, which I find really fascinating, is that the investor class has found you. You know, it used to be that the people who ran and owned the process industries were process industries people. They were owners, they were operators. They had grown up through the chemical engineering ranks to then run and own these companies. We're seeing some pretty drastic changes in that now, as investors are starting to take over. And the best example that I can think of that I actually had a chance to work with purposefully was Ascend Performance Materials. Is anybody here from Ascend today?
My husband works there.
Your husband works there, okay. So you can test this story. Great company. A lot of admiration for Ascend. They've done a lot of things right. In fact, I'll tell you why and how they've done things right. Ascend was part of the old Monsanto. You remember Monsanto? My father worked at Monsanto for 30 years, ran their engineering department down in Texas City. And so I got to know Monsanto really, really well. So in 2008, this private equity firm called SK Capital came along and bought all of Monsanto, well then turned into Solutia, bought Solutia's assets to make a product, Nylon 6,6. The 3 plants that make that nylon, all from raw materials like naphtha and ammonium, goes through a lot of process, and eventually nylon comes out the other end. So an investor, a financial investor, SK Capital, bought them for pennies on the dollar in 2008. Remember what 2008 was like? Wasn't a good time to own, big chemical assets, frankly. Bought them for pennies on the dollar. And then after they bought them, they started asking questions that had never been asked in the Monsanto days. So, to give you an example, Monsanto makes nylon. And by God, we make nylon. We make nylon 6,6. Making more nylon is always better than making less nylon. We make nylon. The financial people said, well, yeah, but when you make nylon, you're also making 36 other byproducts. HCN, cyanide, all kind of other nasty stuff. And those happen to have pretty lucrative markets. So maybe there are times when we should make less nylon if that allows us to make more of these byproducts that had these nice margins. That would have been heresy in the Monsanto days. That would have never come up on the radar. But what are these people about? The investor class cares about one thing, and that's money. And that's, frankly, that's kind of refreshing. That cuts through all the sort of the political stuff and everything. It's all about making money. It's about juicing this machine in a way to make more money versus less. And if we can make more money making these other byproducts versus nylon, let's give it a try and see how it works. So we worked with Ascend. We built a few models to help them understand why and under what circumstances it might make sense to sort of style the production in a way that actually generated more margin instead of more nylon. So the investor class has found your industries and it's grabbing hold and it's going to change the way things work for you. We had kind of an earth-shaking event happen early this year. The first hostile takeover of a chemical company. When Westlake Chemical, run by the Chow family, very wealthy family here in Houston, took over Axiall. There's never been a hostile takeover, ever, in the chemical industry. That's something to take note of. The investor class is coming, and they're coming with a point of view about making money, which is going to slightly change the strategy and the operating style of many of these process industries. The other thing that's starting to happen, and again, this kind of follows on with this notion of the investor class taking a look at your companies, is the idea about making a science out of everything that you do. Now, to a certain extent, you've done that. You've done that with MobilOps. You know, you've taken something that used to be kind of on paper and handled rather loosely, and you're starting to be more disciplined about that. And I would argue you're kind of making a science out of maintenance and safety through the lens of this particular technology. That's reflective of the trend across lots and lots of other industries. Let's go back to professional sports. The Miami Dolphins, not one of my clients, but some friends of mine are working with them. Miami Dolphins did this. They took a tiny computer called a Raspberry Pi. How many of you have ever heard of a Raspberry Pi? It's a little computer, $25. It's used to teach kids programming. Well, it became this sort of cottage industry that just sort of took off, where you could buy these Raspberry Pis, these little computers that could do computing, and people would put them in weather balloons and all kind of things. What the Dolphins did was they wrapped them in Velcro, and they strapped them to the back of every player. And they started to run drills. Ran drills and drills and drills with these things. Again, can't use them in a real game, unfortunately. So they have to use them in practice. And these computers were hooked to the Dolphins players and could measure heart rate and breathing and movement, and they all had GPS chips in them so they could do motion and everything. What were they looking for? Well, as it turns out, one of the critical decisions that's made in a game that you never see is, when do I put my second string players in? When do I put them in? If I put my second string players in too early, I don't have the benefit of my star players. If I put them in too late, then I risk my star players getting hurt or tired, and that's a problem. I gotta get that just right. So what's that just right time? Well, it turns out the Miami Dolphins figured that out. And if you have, say, a running back, they don't make a habit of like switching out running backs a whole lot. There's a lot, mostly offensive line and defensive players that you see switching out. But again, you don't really notice. You notice if the quarterback comes out and then goes in, but the O-line and the defensive players you don't. So they're constantly actually swapping out these players. When do you put the second string in? It turns out these slightly imperceptible changes in speed. So I start off in the first quarter, and I'm hitting the next guy really fast, and maybe by the second quarter I'm doing it just a little slower, and then by the third quarter, a little bit slower. There's a drop-off time that they were able to calculate by collecting the sensor data and figure out when to swap in and out players. They made a science out of that decision. Rather than just leaving it to the coaches to kind of look from the sideline and kind of make good guesses, they decided to use the data and sensors to figure that out. And we're seeing that trend happen all over. This notion of making a science out of these mundane things. So, let me give you an example. So we ran into a company a while back that was an airline, and this airline was deeply interested in jet fuel. Now, most of the other airlines, when they bought jet fuel, they consider jet fuel just I buy jet fuel to get my planes in the air. And I have to. I don't consider that a competitive advantage. This particular airline, based in the southwestern part of the United States, let's just say, was really focused on operational excellence. They had chosen operational excellence as the key plank in their strategy. And so they started looking at, what do we spend money on? They went down the list. Jet fuel, third biggest expense on the P&L. Can we be the best jet fuel buyers in the entire industry? Okay, so they called me up and they asked me to come in and sort of take a look at jet fuel. And I said, well, what's the deal with jet fuel? They said, look, jet fuel along the Gulf Coast there, really cheap. When you go to the Midwest, a little more expensive. When you go to the East and West Coast, it's very expensive. So how can you flow and refuel more aircraft in the cheaper cities versus the expensive cities, while taking into account the extra weight of the cheap fuel and all that? So they started to develop this notion called tankering, which is buying cheap fuel in one city and flying it to the next city. So instead of just enough fuel to get to the next destination plus a safety margin, fill the tanks all the way up when you're in a cheap city. But it's a complicated math question, right? Because you've got to figure out how that's going to affect your schedule and how that's going to affect flights downstream and so on. And fly 660 segments a day. It's a mind-bogglingly complicated math question. So we put the data to that question. And we determined that there was this huge physical arbitrage between the cheap cities and the expensive cities, so that they could, in fact, make these small changes to their operations and realize these extraordinary differences in their overall jet fuel economics. And they did that through the lens of data and simulation. And what was interesting about that, we did this a dozen years ago. About 2 years after we did this work, they went on, I think largely inspired by this work, they went on to build a comprehensive jet fuel hedging strategy. And then it was about 3 years ago, the CEO of Southwest of an airline gave an interview in Forbes. Nobody's recording this, are they? He gave an interview in Forbes, and he credited that fuel hedging strategy as being their #1 competitive advantage. This particular airline had 7 straight years of being profitable, while those same 7 straight years, none of the other U.S. airlines were profitable. None. They were the only one. So, how did that happen? This obscure function of jet fuel, they took and elevated it to a science. And you're doing that to a certain extent too. It's not obscure, but you're taking important functions around maintenance and safety, and you're elevating that to a science by infusing data into that whole operation. So you're consistent with this positive trend that's going on all in the different industries. Now, another thing that's dramatically changing is the whole idea of relationships with your suppliers or your service providers. That's undergoing massive change. Now, let me take any one of your companies in particular and take a supplier to your company. And what's the relationship there? I'm your supplier, so I come to you and I beg you, can I please supply you with some product or service? And you say, oh yeah, talk to Jim in the procurement department. So I go over to Jim and talk to Jim in the procurement department. And he beats me down and beats me down and beats me down to get the best price that he can get out of me. And finally I'm dealing with 5% margins of supplying this product or service to you. That's a great relationship, huh? Not really. Most enlightened companies and industries are starting to rethink that. Because what happens when you beat up your supplier to get a better price? You're giving them incentives not to invest in relationship-specific assets, not to contribute whatsoever to the value that's being exchanged between you. No margin left at all to develop a joint supply chain between you. It's, in a sense, it's like that company paying a hidden tax because of the inefficiency of that relationship. Now, what enlightened firms are doing is they're saying, look, is there a better way? Can we actually create incentives for our suppliers to work with us to lower the cost of the delivery of service? Could we, I know this is heresy, actually give them a percentage of the gain called a gain sharing agreement? This is a principle that comes out of the science of game theory, forming coalitions. So we're starting to see people wake up to this relationship between their suppliers by reinventing it. So I have an example I'm going to show you here in a minute, where I was working with a company that works in the upstream side of the industry, around the supply of vessels, marine vessels to deliver goods offshore, to offshore platforms. These vessels are very expensive. They lease for $5,500 a day and up. And they deliver, water and methanol and diesel fuel and drilling mud, all those kind of materials back and forth from a shore base out to these platforms. And they wanted to develop, this is Shell, wanted to develop a supply chain between them that was a bit more, worked better, a bit more like, they wanted relationship-specific assets to be built. They wanted a joint design. So we helped them build that through the lens of a simulation model. So here's what that looked like. There it is. Okay, so here's the shore bases, and here's the platforms. And so what you're seeing is the simulation model running on the actual sort of use case here. And you can see it because it's obscured. If you look at the little scorecard down here, we're using 6 vessels to do all this work. Okay, so Shell said to the boat supplier, he said, we will let you keep half the savings if you start retiring vessels out of the fleet. So if we can use less than 6 for every vessel, you get to keep half the savings. So the company, came to us and asked us to do some analysis and figure out, can we move that same amount of cargo with fewer vessels than 6 and make that all work correctly? So that resulted in something that looked a whole lot like this. Okay, same basic scenario, same number of platforms we're servicing, same material, but now we're doing it with 4 vessels instead of 6. How do we do that? Smaller, slightly lighter, faster vessels. We figured out how to load them in a different way. The supplier did. And through ideas that were exchanged on both sides, we were able to come to an agreement that benefited all the companies. 4 vessels instead of 6. That means 2 vessels got retired out of the fleet. Edison Schwest Offshore, which was the supplier, got to keep half the savings. And oh, by the way, they took those 2 vessels to West Africa and got even higher day rates off that. So they were very happy. The gentleman who owns Edison Schwest owns the New Orleans basketball team and several banks and so forth. So he's doing pretty well these days. But that's how we did it. So gain sharing agreements, different relationships with suppliers that are built not just on trust, but built on joint work, creating incentives in that exchange between you, enlisting the help of the supplier in lowering the cost of delivery instead of just beating them down, get some artificial best price. That's what's happening in this industry. It has been happening with a lot of other industries as well. That's the 4th one. So the 5th one that I'll kind of conclude with is what I think is probably the most important trend, and one of the ones that's probably going to affect you personally the most, which is automation. Automation is coming. Now, you can say, our process plants are highly automated. We have these big distributed control systems, and everything is run by that massive computer and so forth. Yeah, fine. That's all the physical automation, and that's been going on for 40 years. I'm talking about automating a lot of the white-collar processes that happen on top of that. That's what's happening. And the things that we thought could never be automated are now being automated. So creative processes, thinking processes are being automated. The FAA released a paper this past summer. And in that paper, they speculated about pilotless air flights. No pilot. Honestly, right now, 60% of the flights are already automated. I don't know if you knew that. Why should we have a human? Why don't we have a machine actually flying the plane? Some people tell me, I would never get on a plane that didn't have a pilot. Well, But are you aware of the risks that you bear now with a human pilot? Are the risks higher or lower? So, leukemia right now is a disease that is very, very hard to diagnose. It's similar to other cancers. It's a terrible disease. Most of the leukemia cases that go through MD Anderson are diagnosed by machine, not by human doctors. Because they found that machines are actually superior to humans in that one thing, which is diagnosis. Machines are not subject to things like temporal bias. You know, if the patient that you saw last week looms larger in your brain as a doctor than the patient you saw a year ago, yet the patient you saw a year ago might be more relevant to the case that you're seeing now. Machines don't have that kind of bias, along with a stack of all other kind of biases. Humans are fallible. So what we're going to see is a lot of automation of these white-collar processes. So planning and strategy and scheduling and things that probably in your companies is kind of a black art. You have this one person who's been there for 30 years. Gosh, they know it really well. And I hope he or she never dies or anything because they're so good at it because they've learned it over the years. That kind of thing is going to have to go away. I mean, another thing about the process industries too, I don't have the exact figures, but there was something like, if you take an experienced engineer in the industry, the average age was something around 53, 54 years old. Well, those people are going to be leaving the industry very soon. We've got a new generation coming up. So how are we going to systematically, institutionally codify the knowledge that these experienced people have? What we do now is we just let them walk out the door with all their knowledge. It just kind of goes with them. But that's, again, back to my point about how this is going to affect you personally. Because I would imagine that you are, the people in your companies who have a whole lot of knowledge and a whole lot of experience. I would also imagine that many of you don't have that written down anywhere. It's just, it's in my head, I know it. But this is going to be the legacy that you're going to have to leave behind for another generation. Now, a lot of people, and I'm writing a book about automation. It's my second book. It's called How Clever is the Working Title. So I'm studying this whole kind of idea. A lot of people tell me, so you're going to replace me with a computer and then you're going to fire all these people and so it's all going to be machines and people. There's been a lot of supposedly intelligent, influential people who've written books about this sort of mass unemployment that's going to hit us because of automation. Well, I'm just not buying it. Because in my discussions with senior leaders, both in your industry and outside your industry, it's never been about, let's bring in the machines and fire all the people. It's a lot more been about, I've got 100 people and we do this much work. I want to take those same 100 people and do this much work. So how do I leverage the people that I have? That makes the people you have more valuable, not less. Because that's the base on which you're going to build these sort of automated leveraged layers. Automation is coming. And I can't stop it. You can't stop it. The economics of it are just too compelling. We're going to head into, very soon, inside of 5 years, a much more automated world than what we've had. So your job, you thought your job was to just keep the plant running and keep people safe every day. Well, yeah, okay, that's kind of your job. That's not really your job. Your job is to take the knowledge and expertise that you have and to start to write that down, and to start to codify that in some way. No, you don't have to do it yourself. But there will be people who will come along and say, we want to replicate the knowledge and experience you have. Can you tell us how thus and such works? And you'll tell them how it works, and that will be put into some kind of system. The fastest growing part of my own business is where somebody's built some big old Excel spreadsheet over years and years of time. Nobody knows how it works, and it's Joe down the hall. He knows it really well, and he's built it over 14 years. And we don't really know anything about it, but gosh, it's there. And we're going to have his retirement party next week. That's good for business. I'm putting my kids through college with work just like that. So you can see that we're starting to see this trend toward capturing and automation. So I'll just leave you with that. I mean, this involves more than just getting your job done every day. This involves using tools to help you, long after you're gone, long after you leave the scene, help the next generation run that much more effectively, that much more efficiently. And what I'm also seeing is that's going to give rise, we think, to a resurgence in American manufacturing. Manufacturing is, over the last 2 decades, is about 60% of it is gone. We're starting to see a trend of reshoring it, but when it comes back, it's going to come back in a different form. It's going to come back in a more automated form, and you all could be at the apex of that trend. So those are the five key points. And I hope this is helpful. I hope it was valuable. I really do appreciate inviting me to come in and chat with you. You probably agree with me on some points and maybe disagree with me on some points, and that's completely fine. I'm going to be, as John mentioned, I'm going to be around a good part of the day, so if you want to ask me questions about some of the things that I've said, or you want to talk about some of the things that I've said, I'm happy to do it. And again, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Questions for George, anybody?